I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. What I want to talk about today is GoPro settings, and not just GoPro settings because not all of us have a GoPro, but if you've got a camera, a high-def camera on your quad, there are a few settings you might be able to change, if your camera lets you, to get the best looking footage out of it. That's what we're talking about today. And I'm going to take a piece of advice given by Paul Nurkkala, somebody who certainly knows a thing or two about making cinematic videos, and deconstruct it a little bit. And actually, Paul's going to get a chance to weigh in and respond to my advice. What I really want to talk about in this video is some advice that guys like Paul Nurkkala and Kebab FPV have been giving for getting the best looking video out of your camera. And it has to do with adjusting the camera's shutter speed and ISO and white balance. And we are going to talk about that, but I don't want to overlook the most basic question. I hate videos where they dive deep into some esoteric topic, but then they overlook something really obvious and basic and leave a lot of people out in the cold. What resolution do I recommend that you use when you're shooting high-def video for FPV? The answer to that is, with a GoPro, I usually use either 2.7K 30 FPS resolution or 1080p 60 FPS resolution. And the reason I use those is because those are the resolutions that my GoPro, usually I'm shooting with a Hero 5 Session, those are the resolutions where it supports Super View. I feel like Super View is mandatory, is not quite too strong a word. Almost all FPV footage that I see, I think it looks best with Super View on. Super View gives a wider vertical field of view to let you really get a sense of proximity. And anytime you're in proximity, I think you should be shooting Super View. The exception to the rule might be if you're doing some kind of cinematic landscape shot where you're a little bit far from, you're not flying up next to anything and you kind of want a little bit more sort of zoomed in look. When you're shooting with Super View, you're going to be limited. The GoPro is going to limit you on what resolutions you can actually do. If you've got a Hero 7, you have more options. You can do 4K Super View 30, I think, with a Hero 7. With a Hero 6, you have fewer, and with a Hero 5 Session, it's 2.7K 30 or 1080p 60. Those are the resolutions that it supports Super View at. That's my #1 goal. I want Super View. Whatever I have to do to get it, I'm going to. Now, which of those two resolutions I prefer depends on the type of flying I'm doing. For general freestyle flying and cinematic stuff, 2.7K 30 is where I shoot. The lower frame rate actually helps hide just a little bit of jello and shake. The higher frame rate is smoother looking, but it lets some of those defects come out. If I'm doing a tuning video, on the other hand, I'll always try to shoot in 60 FPS because I want you to be able to see every little shake and bobble of the quad. But in general, 2.7K 30 is where I shoot most of my stuff. The other reason I like 2.7K is because when you upload to YouTube in 2.7K, you get a higher bit rate. YouTube will use a higher bit rate. And so even if you shoot in 1080, I actually recommend that you export in 2.7K and upload to YouTube in 2.7K, and then even though there's not actually any additional resolution in the shot, YouTube will use a higher bit rate when it plays it back to the viewer, assuming the viewer is watching in 2.7K, and the viewer will get a better experience. The bit rates that YouTube uses for video are not optimized for the kind of fast, continuous motion that FPV videos contain. And so if you just upload regular 1080, it's just going to kind of look, well, it's going to look pretty crappy. Export to 2.7K and then upload in 2.7K and you'll get better results, even if your original video is 1080. But I often shoot the original video in 2.7K just because I think you get, well, why not? But then the question is, why not shoot in 4K? And the big answer to that for me is that with many cameras, 4K will not support Super View. Now, if you've got a Hero 7, you can shoot in Super View in 4K. And if you don't have a GoPro at all, then the question of Super View is kind of moot because GoPro has a patent on Super View and nobody else does it. So if you want to shoot in 4K, go right ahead. But #1, you need to make sure that your camera has a very high bit rate. Some cameras have as low as 45 megabit per second bit rate for 4K video, and for FPV, that's just not fast enough. You're going to do better with like a 2.7K resolution because the bit rate at 2.7K is going to be better suited. You're going to have more megabits per pixel, if you will, at 2.7K with most cameras. If you got a camera like the GoPro Hero 7, I think it has like 95 or 100 megabits per second for 4K video, that's plenty of bit rate. And the only downside then is that it makes truly massive files. Gigantic files. You're going to fill up the SD card, you're going to fill up your hard drive, and then when you go to upload the file to YouTube, it's going to take 27 freaking years. 27 freaking years. And it's just, 4K is just a real, editing 4K is, it's just a real bear. For most people, the results are not worth it. And that's why 2.7K is my go-to. So then let's talk about the exposure settings. Our goal with exposure is always to have a shutter speed that is 1/2 times the frame rate. So if your frame rate is 30 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second. And in order to demonstrate that, I've come over to the bench where I have a nice DSLR camera where I can adjust the frame rate, or the shutter speed rather, very easily. Now we're recording in 30 FPS. So if I reach up here and I adjust what I want to demonstrate is this. I want to adjust let me adjust it so I have just a really slow shutter speed, and it's going to get super overexposed. What I can do, because this is a fancy DSLR, is I can stop down the aperture to get the exposure approximately back where it was. So you can't do that, by the way, with a GoPro or a typical action cam, because they have a fixed aperture. And what I want you to see is that as I move my hand back and forth, the super slow shutter speed is super duper blurry, right? And that's not good. It's really just unusable, right? You don't like that. Now as I bring the shutter speed down 1/20th, let's say, this is 1/30th. Now this is 1 over our frame rate, and again I'm going to adjust the aperture here just to get this exposure back approximately where it was. Okay, now we are at 1 over our frame rate, and as I move my hand, you can see there's a little bit of motion blur, but it's not like weirdly creepily bad, but it's maybe a little blurrier than you might prefer. Okay, fine. Now we're going to go to 1/2 times the frame rate, which is 1/60. And again, I'll adjust the aperture just to bring the exposure approximately back where it was. 1/60. Now you can see that, well, that looks pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. Now, that's sharper, right? We got just the tiniest amount of blur on that motion, but overall, it's pretty sharp and nice. What happens if we make it sharper? Now I'm going to take that shutter speed and I'm going to just take it to like 1/250, which is 8 times the frame rate. And I'm going to need to open the aperture up. And unfortunately now, I can't open the aperture any further. We're at f3.5. The lens will not open up anymore. This is going to be the limit of what I can do while keeping the exposure roughly the same. And if I move my hand, you can see that it's super, like, juddery is a good word for what we're seeing here. It doesn't look good, does it? Watch, I'm going to keep moving my hand and I'm going to bring it back down to 1/60. That exposure back. Oh, that's better, isn't it? So we want to keep the frame rate at about 1/2 times the shutter speed because that produces a pleasing amount of motion blur without looking too super blurry or smeary. And of course, there is some room for artistic interpretation on this. And Kebab FPV, Bob Ruge, actually has a fantastic video he's done where he plays with this stuff and shows you examples of videos with more or less motion blur based on the shutter speed that he's targeting. Paul Nurkkala, Nurk FPV, also has some videos talking about this. Okay. The problem when you're shooting FPV is if your shutter speed rather, is too fast, not only do you not get pleasing motion blur, but you also get jello is much worse. It's enhanced, right? Whereas when you have a slower shutter speed, it hides some of the jello and vibration and things just look a lot more nice and pleasing. And that's why many people use neutral density filters, ND filters, also sometimes known as jello killers. Because And the problem is that even during like not quite twilight, but even as it's getting toward the end of the day when it's starting to get darker, there's still so much light that the camera just can't achieve that 1/60 shutter speed. It has to run a faster shutter speed in order to prevent overexposing the image. The other tool that the camera has to work with here is the ISO. And so one thing you can, well, you know what? Let's go look at a GoPro and let's see it. So here we are in the Hero 5 session. And if we look at the settings available, the first thing we're going to want is we're going to want Pro Tune turned on, because that's what gives you access to all of these settings that we're going to want to set. And the next thing we're going to want to look at is the ISO limit. Now the ISO is how sensitive the camera sensor is, and for shooting in low light, you often as a photographer want a higher ISO so you capture more light and you can get better pictures in lower light, but not for FPV. For FPV, we want to limit the amount of light that's hitting the sensor because we want to slow the shutter speed down. That might not be true if you're shooting very close to twilight. It can be dark enough out that you then want to open the ISO up and make the sensor more sensitive. So here in the Hero 5 session, I can hit the ISO limit. And for shooting in dark areas, I might choose 1600, which is more sensitive. But most of the time, I'm going to choose 400, which is, well, to be honest with you, it's still pretty sensitive. It's going to be very hard to get down to 1/60 or 1/120 if you're shooting at 60 FPS. And the answer then is that you need a neutral density filter, which is basically just a dark piece of glass you put, a very precisely dark piece of glass that you put in front of it, and it makes less light get in. It causes the shutter to open up and allows you to hit that desired shutter speed. So when I'm shooting with the Hero 5 session, what I will typically do is I'll choose flat for the color. Now you're going to need to use something like Premiere or DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut to do post-processing on it if you shoot in flat. If you don't intend to do any color grading afterwards, then shoot in GoPro Color, but you get better results shooting in flat. For shutter speed, I'll set it to auto, and ISO limit, I'll set the ISO limit as low as I can get to force the shutter speed as slow as it can be. Here in my poor beat up Hero 7, oh, I'm sorry, GoPro, I have a few more options. If I can go here to the video settings, you can see that when I go to set the shutter speed, I have just more flexibility here in the shutter speed I can set. In general, I'm going to want to lock it here at 1/120. Or am I? Hold on, we'll talk about that in a second. And here when I do the ISO, I'll have the choice of ISO min and ISO max. So if I want to lock this at 100 ISO, and by the way, you can see here, I can go all the way down to 100 ISO with the full GoPro, whereas the Hero only lets me go to 400, Hero 5 session. Unless we go to 400. So I can lock it at 100 ISO, and I can choose to have auto shutter or manually locked shutter speed. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, because I saw a video from Paul Nurkkala saying that he recommended locking the shutter speed. And it's true that locking the shutter speed ensures that you will always get that desirable motion blur that you're going for. If you are shooting at 30 FPS and you lock the shutter speed at 1/60, then you're going to get consistent motion blur. But the GoPro has a lot fewer tools then at its disposal to get the exposure right. The GoPro can't adjust the aperture. It has a fixed aperture lens. All of them do. All the action cameras do. So then what could it do? Well, if you lock the shutter speed, the only thing left is that it has available is the ISO. And it can stop the ISO down to 100 or 400, but that's not very much. And what's going to happen is this. So here's some footage that I shot while I was in Atlanta the other weekend, and in this video I tried what Paul Nurkkala advises of locking your shutter speed and locking your ISO so your exposure is absolutely consistent throughout your entire flight. And he's right, this produces consistent results. And if you look here, like, let's look as I start flying. Now, the exposure here, you can see I'm struggling already with the exposure. This is a shutter speed actually of 1/120. Now with my frame rate of 30 FPS, I should have a shutter speed of, is it 130 FPS? Yeah, 30 FPS. So I should have a frame rate of 1/60, but that was way too overexposed. This is with ISO locked at 100 and 1/120 And okay, it's usable. Let's try some flying and let's see how it comes out. And I want you to see, here's that motion blur that we're talking about. It looks kind of crappy and blurry in a still frame, but when you're in motion, it actually looks really nice. And in fact, yeah, you can see it's just smoothly moving by there. It's very nice. In fact, we could probably do it a little bit more if we were going with sort of industry guidelines. But hang on. So here I am under a building, and watch what happens as I come out of the building and pop up into the sky. Oops. This is not a usable shot. This is a completely unusable shot. It's so overexposed. And the reason for that is that I set my exposure back here under the trees. And that exposure was correct when I was flying around. This is a fine exposure, maybe a slightly overexposed, but easy to fix in post. This is a great exposure, but there's so much oh, see, this is unusable. And that was my first concern when I heard the advice to lock your shutter speed and ISO, that you would get these changes in exposure throughout the flight that made the video basically unusable. Now, I asked Paul Nurkkala about this during a live stream on quadcamp.com, and I'll show you his actual answer. It's a little bit of a long answer since it was a live stream, but I'll let him speak for himself. But the gist of the answer was twofold. Number one, when you set your exposure, if you're gonna lock your exposure by aiming the camera up at the sky or somewhere bright, and set your exposure, stop it down so that you are exposed for the brightest area. Some areas when you're flying will be underexposed, but it's easier to correct an underexposed image than an overexposed image, and you can generally get okay results. Bear in mind that Paul's recommendation is that you're going to be using ND filters, not locking the shutter speed. As you can see, even under the trees, I was just barely able to get the shutter speed to be slow enough or fast enough to get the exposure right. There's no way I could get the correct shutter speed out of this super bright image in the sky without an ND filter. But the other thing Paul said was that if you're just flying, don't lock your shutter speed. Don't lock your ISO, because you'll get results like this. Put an ND filter on your camera so that your shutter speed at the brightest part is approximately 1/60 or 1/120 if you're shooting at 60 FPS. But then let the camera make the changes. Let the auto exposure work so that when you get done flying, you have usable image. If you really are going to lock the shutter speed, then you need to be planning your images out. And you know, you'll do one shot and then you'll do another shot and you'll set it for each time. But for typical freestyle flying, you do want auto exposure active to make sure that well, do you want it active? Because I got to tell you, if you're going to start seeing it when I show it to you, like here is a shot I did. Here's a shot I did with ISO is locked at 400, I think, but the shutter is auto, so the camera is allowed to change the exposure. And what I want you to see is, as I pop up here into the sky, you see how the exposure adjusted just there to bring the sky? And that's good because it means we get a usable image, but it does make your job harder as you're doing stuff in post, and it can be a little bit distracting to the viewers as the exposure is constantly changing. Oh, there, see it brightened up. And now as we come through here, yeah, I don't know. There's definitely an argument for the results of locking the exposure are good because you get very consistent image. But I think for most of the kind of flying we do where the lighting is constantly changing, you're not going to get a good result if you lock the exposure the whole time. So I'm going to let Paul speak for himself, give you a little more detail about that, and that's how we're going to close this video. To sum up, though, the settings that I recommend: 1080p 60 for like tuning or ultra smooth stuff, 2.7K 30 resolution for typical freestyle flying. Pro Tune is on if you have a GoPro. Shoot in Pro Tune flat if you intend to color grade afterwards. Shoot in GoPro Color if you don't intend to color grade afterwards, but you'll get better results with color grading if you have the tools, the skills, and the time. Lock your ISO as low as possible to force the shutter speed to be as slow as possible, unless you're shooting in very dark, like twilight-ish areas where you need that higher ISO. And then get the shutter speed as close to 1/2 times your frame rate, typically going to be 1/60 or 1/120. And if you need to do that using ND filters, then go ahead. Only lock your shutter speed if you know for a fact that the exposure around your whole shot or your whole flight is going to be within acceptable range, and you're not going to get an ultra underexposed or an ultra overexposed image. That's going to do it for this video. I'll let Paul Nurkkala and tuck you out over on Quad Camp Online. Okay, so Nurk, here's the reason you're here. Enough talking about how great you are. You did a video talking about your GoPro settings, and I watched it. And in that video, I think you talked about manually setting your exposure. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
You talked about locking your shutter at 1 over twice your frame rate and locking your ISO. And I showed some footage, and I appreciate the advantage of that, but I showed some footage where I was flying under tree cover and then I popped up above the tree cover, and basically as soon as I pop up above the tree cover, it's totally overexposed and basically unusable. And I'm curious, like, how would you deal with a situation like that?
Expose for the brightest part of the video. So I don't like, the reason that you do this is to control exposure through the entire shot. So like if you're filming on like a normal camera and you're filming manually, right, you're setting your ISO, you're setting your shutter speed, you're setting your aperture, and achieving a certain shot in a certain way. Okay, you're essentially taking that idea, that principle, and doing it with your GoPro. And what that means is that as you're transitioning from location to location, the exposure doesn't start to like wander, right? So like as you go under the canopy, you know, it starts to it lets more light in because it's darker under there, and then as you come out of the canopy, everything's blown out for a second until it re-exposes for the sky. And to me, that doesn't look very good. So I would rather find what I want it to expose for and then suffer the darker and the brighter spots as a result. And usually that means that I expose for the brightest part because I like to see the sky. I like to see all the clouds, like the detail of the clouds and all that in the video. And then the darker areas, like, you know, it increases the contrast kind of down low.
Yeah. That's interesting. One of the first things I always do when I shoot in ProTune Flat is bring the shadows down. So perhaps exposing for the sky, you'd end up with darker shadows, but you were going to pull them down anyway, and you might actually end up with a different result, a better result.
Yeah, and to be honest, like most of the time, the look that I like is bringing the shadows up and the highlights down. It kind of makes it a little bit more of like an HDR, high dynamic range kind of feeling. Now, and something that I should have made more clear in that video that I made about GoPro stuff and exposure and all of that was that I don't do this every single time. It's a huge pain in the butt to like, okay, am I setting my exposure right, and am I stopping it down the right amount, and am I recording at the right like, this is if I'm like going out and I'm gonna film a freestyle video, but if I'm like, you know, if I want to just rip a couple packs, like just put it on auto. Yeah, don't worry about it.
So two questions are coming to mind. The first one is that, like, the way I did it when I was trying it out is as I was getting ready to fly, I kind of looked the camera around and I adjusted the settings. By the way, it's much nicer to do this with a GoPro Hero than a Hero Session, because on the Session, you got to be looking at your phone. Yeah. But on a Hero, you got the screen and you can just tweak and adjust. And I got it looking good, but then of course I popped up above it was a white roof of a building, so it was really the worst case scenario in terms of it blowing out.
Sure.
But I'm not sure how could I have set the exposure for that white roof of the building other than to fly and then come back and land and look at the footage.
That's a good point. Did you put a filter on it? Some sort of
I didn't have an ND filter. What I was doing, I locked ISO at 100, and then I just adjusted the shutter speed. And I said, well, it won't be 1 over 2 times the frame rate, but at least it'll be locked, and I won't get that changing exposure that you're talking about.
Yeah, at that point, like, I would look at the sky. I would get like majority sky, like, you know, maybe 2/3 sky, 1/3 a tree or something like that, exposed for the sky, and usually that would mean set my shutter speed at 1 over 60, and then use ND filters until I get it where I want it. Typically, you know, especially like shooting in midday or like late day, you know, it's a one. Like an ND16 filter, ND32, and then yeah, I just typically underexpose because it's easier to bring things up than bring things down.
That's true. The way that digital image sensors work is you usually get more shadow detail than highlight detail, and it's easier to bring shadows up and bring detail out, whereas highlights, when they blow out, there's basically nothing there. Is that right?
I believe so. At least in my experience, it's been easier to deal with that. Like, because like on one hand, you're dealing with the sun, literally the brightest thing in our galaxy, or not the sun. So I'd rather I'd rather solve the sun than everything else.
That makes sense. And you're saying you would just literally just point the camera up at the sky and adjust the exposure so basically the sky is not completely blown out. You can see, you know, you can see some clouds, maybe a little bit of blue, and then that would basically give you correct exposure when you pop up above the trees, more or less.
Yeah, and it still looks good below.
So that's the next question I was going to ask. Have you run into a scenario where there's so much dynamic range that when you expose for the sky, it's just too dark? You know, when you fly through that train tunnel, I don't know. Have you run into any scenarios where you can't get the dynamic range to work?
I have not run into it, but I also think that hasn't happened because I have planned what my shot will be ahead of time. Right? It's again when I take the time to set all of these settings and really lock everything down, it's because I am being very meticulous about the shot and the segment and the things that I'm shooting. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just on auto. So like, you know.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're doing the kind of shoot where you're putting this kind of planning into it, well, I mean, if you think about how motion pictures are filmed, they don't just set one exposure and then do the whole shot. They plan the shot. So you would say, okay, I'm going to do this. Well, first, I'm going to pop up above the trees, then I'm going to fly through the train tunnel, and you wouldn't do that in one take. You would plan it out and, you know, make it work.
Yes, or have, you know, somebody else on a separate controller where they're adjusting it as the camera's moving, like, you know. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you do that with a GoPro?
Who does that?
Not on a GoPro, but like, yeah, sorry. that's how they might solve it in a motion.
Or like an actual motion picture. I saw one of the coolest things, and if you're a photographer, you know all about this, but it blew my mind. It was a circular polarizing filter, where as you turn the polarizing filter ring, it changes it go from, like, you know, ND2 to ND32 or whatever. And the guy was shooting, this was Dan, by the way, anybody knows Dan who shoots for Rotor Riot sometimes. He was shooting fixed shutter speed, fixed ISO, fixed aperture, and would just adjust the shutter using the polarizing filter. And it really blew my mind because it just means you have exactly the shot you want. And it's totally smooth. You don't see stop as you change this exposure. It's totally smooth. It really
that's a great technique that Capper showed me that on a shoot at some point. He handed me a camera with the variable ND filter, and I was like, ooh, that's kind of neat. You just like stop it down till all of the overexposed sections go away.
It would never work for, well, I mean, I guess it could work if you could make one for a GoPro on a quad, but the ring would have to have like ratcheting clicks so it would hold while you were flying. But then you wouldn't need like an ND8, an ND4. You could just take this little thing, put it on your GoPro, and go tick, 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 and dial it in to where it need to
be. Circular, like variable ND filters for GoPros do exist, but they are expensive and fragile. So it's like,
maybe for just a cinematic look, it might work, but not for any type of